Welcome everyone to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. We are so pleased today to be wrapping up our fall quarter seminars with Dr. Ted Johnson, who will be speaking about his new book, When the Stars Begin to Fall. Just a note for our Zoom audience, if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to send them in on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So to introduce today's speaker, Ted is a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. His work examines the role that race plays in electoral politics and disparities in policy outcomes. He was a national fellow at New America, that's how we met originally, and was a former research manager at Deloitte. He is a retired commander in the United States Navy, a former White House fellow, and former speechwriter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He has a BA in mathematics from Hampton University, an ALM from Harvard University, and a doctorate in law and policy from Northeastern. His dissertation, I think, was part of the work that has gone into this book, and we look forward to hearing from him today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. I think what I wanted to do was just sort of talk through a few of the vignettes that are in the book, and then some of the ideas that provide the foundation for the book, and then have a conversation from there. So look, the book is part memoir. It's part unpacking of political science and sociological and philosophical and all these kind of very academic frameworks. And then it's part polemic about like the state of the country and what needs to happen and the why it is that race seems to be this nation's Achilles heel. But I think sort of giving you like the positionality in which I wrote the book might be helpful. As Dee Dee mentioned, I'm a retired military guy from North Carolina. My grandparents were sharecroppers in the Deep South. My parents were the first generation of folks to go to college, and they were 30-year IBMers. So I grew up like Theo Huxtable, even though my parents did not. They grew up poor, and in fact, a kind of poverty, surrounded by poverty in the country, such that my mother didn't know she was poor until she went to college because everyone lived the same and she didn't really recognize what she was missing out on. And I'm also, you know, the book is Theodore R. Johnson, but my full name is Theodore Roosevelt Johnson III. So I'm now this Black guy named after a rich, white, turn-of-the-century Republican who was president. And I'm this Black kid who's the grandchild of sharecroppers in the South. So these two experiences, both sort of a child of Jim Crow parents, the importance of education, the importance of the military, and how the solidarities I experienced as a Black American and as a military guy, it sort of combined to make me question why it was that these two parts of my identity seem to be in tension with one another. I mean, this is something Du Bois talked about over a century ago, of two-ness or double consciousness, of the Negro and the American, two warring ideals in one dark body. And I was like, why are they warring? I'm Black and I'm, you know, like citizen exemplar, military, you know, patriot person. Why do I not feel this tension internally? But that tension has defined much of my experiences, much of the nation's history. And I wanted to see if I could wrangle with that tension some, and that is what the book is about. I call this, if you guys remember the movie Slumdog Millionaire, it's, you know, this kid basically has all the answers to how to become a millionaire just based off of life experiences and not through education. This book is kind of like that. Each chapter is some nugget I picked up somewhere that the book is now these pieces of a puzzle coming together in hopes of creating a new picture of what has happened or where we could go. And so if I try to walk through these, I call this book a three-legged stool of three-legged stools, and it's very dry when I start walking through these 9 parts of the stool leg. So instead, I'll tell you this story, which I think sort of encapsulates the big parts of the book. In one of the chapters, I began talking about Route 40 in Maryland. And Route 40 is this rural stretch of it's not even interstate, it's like the old US highway system before the interstate came around that essentially connects the states above the Mason-Dixon line to Washington, D.C. In the late 50s, the early 60s, this is a time when a lot of sub-Saharan African nations are gaining their independence from the nations that have colonized them for many centuries or decades, certainly. And as they're gaining their independence, they're creating ambassadors who are then coming to the UN and coming to DC to present their credentials. Usually what would happen is these African ambassadors would fly to New York, they would sort of get situated, and then they would drive down to Washington, DC to present their credentials to the State Department and to the president. And then usually what would happen is as they're making this drive, somewhere around Route 40, they would need to stop to use the bathroom, to get some coffee, get some food. And the diners and the hotels along Route 40 were all segregated. And so these ambassadors are coming to the powerful United States, who's courting them very heavily to be friends and have some influence. And they stop into a diner and people look at them like they're crazy, like we don't serve Black people here. And often through translators, they are realizing that they're being kicked out. And one story that made Life magazine, Adam Malik Sow, who was an ambassador from Chad, I believe, shows up in this diner called the Bonnie Bray on Route 40, again, northern rural Maryland. And they basically deny him. And when Life magazine reporters show up to ask, why did you serve this ambassador? She responds, I didn't know he was ambassador. He just looked like another run-of-the-mill Negro to me, except she didn't say Negro. She used the other N-word. And this was the state of affairs. This was a problem for the State Department. This was a problem for John F. Kennedy when he was president, because we are in a Cold War with the Soviets. Sub-Saharan Africa, as these nations are gaining their independence, this is fair game now, just like much of Southeast Asia and other places. And so if we are telling the world that we are the democracy, where we believe that in liberty and freedom and the right of people to rule, and the Soviets are the communists who believe in depressing liberty and the state running rampant over the will of the people, when ambassadors show up here and figure out that the freedom doesn't extend to them, that is now a soft power problem that begins to harm the nation's reputation. And so Kennedy and his State Department folks, they lobbied the Maryland governor, the Maryland State Assembly, these diner owners to please serve these ambassadors. You are harming our national security interests. And eventually the diner owners agree to do so, but only for African ambassadors and not for African Americans. And so as word gets out that these diners had now desegregated, Black folks that lived north of Baltimore began like, hey, let's go see the diners. No, we're not serving you. This is for ambassadors. So much so that a trio of news reporters from the Baltimore's longest running Black newspaper, the Afro-American, dressed up as ambassadors from the fake nation of Gobert. And they were served. And they wrote a long newspaper article talking about we were dressed up in there. They rented tuxedos and spoke a fake dialect. And they were taken to a private room and served. Even when they were served, these ambassadors, they're often served in separate rooms so that the white customers wouldn't have to suffer the indignity of sitting beside people of a different race, but served nonetheless. And then when they wrote about hey, we're just some Black guys from Baltimore who tricked them, it became a problem. It would be 3 or 4 more years before those diners in the mid-60s became desegregated because of the NAACP and a few other activist organizations that lobbied hard for it to extend. The point of the story, though, is that racial progress only reached as far as the national interest. And that is probably the major takeaway of the book, is that when the nation has realized most of its progress on the race question, especially as it pertains to Black Americans, it didn't do so because there was this wave of morality that washed across the country, or a wave of moral epiphanies that people suddenly recognized the humanity and dignity of Black folks. It was because it was in the nation's interest to do so. And nations have, states have interests. They don't have an unwavering moral compass or this absolute sense of good and bad or right and wrong. What's right is what's in its interest, and what's good is what's in its interest, and what isn't is bad. If we think about the founding of the country, it was determined that creating the Union was more important than getting rid of slavery. 90 years later, we went to war with 1 million casualties to abolish slavery. Nothing horrible about slavery got more horrible in those 90 years. The only thing that changed was the way to meet the nation's interests. At our founding, the interest was to create a union. Slavery had to persist in the minds of the framers for that to happen. 90 years later, the only way to reunify the country was to abolish slavery. And so we went to war over that cause. And so if this is the governing principle for how states operate, then the way to get through racism, And by this, I don't mean to erase it completely. I don't know if the human condition is even possible, can even accomplish that, but to mitigate its effects is to show the state how it is in its interest to reduce the impacts of structural racism, instead of trying to convince people that their neighbors are worthy of their of standing in solidarity with, instead of making a personal, individual, moral case, you make the case to the state. Now, this is somewhat controversial, I think, because it basically lets a lot of people off the hook for their behaviors. But Ibram Kendi, in his book Stamped, talks about the big idea in that book was racist ideas come from racist policy, not the other way around. And so if you want to get rid of racism, begin with public policy, because it will tell us what the norms of acceptable behavior that then cause people to change how they behave. Okay, so if we think about this, after the Civil War, the greatest era of progress on race in the United States was between 1948 and 1968. And 1948, we get Truman, who desegregates the military and the federal workforce by executive order. 54, we get Brown v. Board that says separate but equal is unconstitutional and basically does away with statutory segregation through the judicial branch of the Supreme Court. In 57, we get a Civil Rights Act, and we also get President Eisenhower deploying the 101st Airborne to Little Rock, Arkansas, to help 9 Black students integrate that high school, as well as to Ole Miss to help James Meredith enroll there. In 1964, we get the Civil Rights Act. 1965, we get the Voting Rights Act. 1968, we get the Fair Housing Act. Those 20 years of progress in every branch of government, executive, judicial, and legislative, again, was not because people suddenly recognized the humanity of Black folks. And my estimation and the estimation of other scholars, it is the United States being responsive to the reputational damage that was happening by not living our principles. When we would tell the world we are the land of the free and home of the brave and democracy is the way forward, the Soviets would reply, and you lynch Negroes. And they didn't have to make a hard sell. You turn on the TV and you see Black folks in sundresses and Sunday suits being hit with batons and fire hoses and German shepherds. It's not hard to imagine that maybe democracy isn't all it's cracked up to be, or maybe the United States isn't telling the full story here. So if change happens only when it's in the state's interest, especially on a question as difficult as racism, then the story of Black America, and this is the case I build in the book, is the story of marrying moral claims, moral demands of the state to the state's interest. And in hopes that when the state sees it's in its interest to do the morally correct thing, that it then will take an action, not because it's the moral thing to do, but because it's in its interest to do it. Okay, so the basic argument of the book is that racism is an existential threat to America. And by this, I mean structural racism is an existential threat to the American idea. The United States, the nation state, has proven it can live comfortably at times with racism, chattel slavery, the dispossession of Native American land and life, how they treated white immigrants and immigrants from especially from China got like a lot of attention from some of the early parts of early folks in the country. How women not having the right to vote until 100 years ago, despite that we're almost 250 years old. Lots of groups have been marginalized in this country. But the argument I'm making is that the American idea, and what I call in the book the promise of America, is the thing that is incompatible with racial inequality. The promise of America is captured in the second paragraph of the Declaration, that we're all created equal, that we have these unalienable rights, including among these life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. If that's the promise of America, nothing in that promise is compatible with structural racism, or never mind the interpersonal kind of racism. So either racism surges and the promise recedes, or the promise is the thing we pursue, and racism necessarily, structural racism, recedes. So these two things cannot exist. They are existential threats to one another, always in tension. And so that's the premise of the book, that we cannot be, the promise of America is not achievable with structural racism, unless structural racism is being reduced or mitigated, the effects of it. Second part of this is that a multiracial national solidarity is the only thing that can help the United States overcome the effects that structural racism has. And this means that people of all races and ethnicities and class and region, et cetera, have to come together to hold the state responsible. What structural racism is, I call it a crime of the state. It is the nation state is in breach of the social contract. And therefore, this racism is not something that white and Black people need to like kumbaya and figure out so that we can have a good America. It's actually a shortfall of the nation state to deliver the promise of America to all of its people of all races and ethnicities. And the only way the state will ever do that is if the people come together across lines of race and ethnicity and demand that the state live up to the promise. It's a high ask, but there is no other way. There's no other pathway, and holding on to a liberal democracy in the process, except to compel people to come together across these lines of difference to make the nation state be a more just and fair and equal place. The last part of the argument is that the experiences of Black America give us clues to what that national solidarity might look like, the attributes of this national solidarity. Not that Black folks hold the answer exclusively, we don't, but every group that has been marginalized in this country, that has had to fight for inclusion in the country, has lessons for how the country can become better. And again, all those groups I named that have been harmed by the state all have lessons for how the state can live up to its principles based on the work they did to be included in our democracy, economy, et cetera. This is a book about the Black experience. From slavery, and I talk about my 3 times great-grandfather, all the way through to present. And I trace this using lots of theories and lots of history, but also lots of memoir, so that when I talk about these big ideas, I give them flesh and bone by talking about my family in the process, to show that these aren't abstract ideas we're talking about, but actual people's lives who are harmed in the process. So maybe the last couple of things I'll say is that 3 of the big contentions is that the only way that this kind of national solidarity is possible is if we also believe 3 things. One is that racism is a crime of the state and not an issue for groups to work out, even though those exist, but something that the state is responsible for remedying. The second is that the promise of America is not colorblind. A colorblind meritocracy is not the fulfillment of America. A color conscious one is. The beauty of this project is that we have these diverse peoples with different histories, different experiences, and they are all seen as equally American despite their differences. This is another very difficult thing for societies to do and certainly to act on, but that is the fulfillment of the promise, that we're not whitewashed into this one national identity, but we get to bring the complexity of our identities and experiences to the American story, which gives it its beauty. And then the third is that, in Federalist Paper 2, Hamilton says, look, I know you guys are a little worried about this Constitution thing and giving up your autonomy as colonies, but you don't have to really worry because we're all the same. We speak the same language, we have the same ancestors, come from the same cultures and customs, and we fought a war together. We're now one people. Of course, that wasn't true then, and it certainly isn't true now. So if we are a nation of more than 330 million people that have really no one thing in common that unites all of us, then what makes us American? And I believe it's the belief in this promise that I talked about. And if that's not the thing, what else connects us? So there are some lessons from Black America on that I discussed in the book. But the other thing I argue for is a sort of a revival, a renewal of America's civil religion. And I will say that after having written that chapter and then watching things like January 6th and some other things, I begin to, the worry that many, even Robert Bellah, who sort of brought America's civil religion to the fore in the 60s, worried that it's like really close to nationalism and can be distorted in that way, and it absolutely has. And yet, I still believe that a civil religion is the thing that is a sort of the set of practices that demonstrates our desire to be in community with one another. quickly on the civil religion, it basically says that the way of belonging in America looks very much like the tenets of any traditional religion. Most religions will have a pantheon or a deity. They'll have canon and scripture. They'll have rituals and observances and practices. They'll have these sort of citizen exemplars. And if you look at American society, we've got all of that. Our deities, our pantheon rather, George Washington and Lincoln and Jefferson and Martin Luther King and others. We've got canon, Declaration, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. We've got rituals, the national anthem and the Pledge of Allegiance, and we've got symbols. And it's not the cross or the crescent moon or the Star of David, but it's the flag, it's the Statue of Liberty, it's the bald eagle. And so when you look at all these things that make a thing a religion in terms of the liturgy or the practice of it, we have that too. And so I think those are the things that can be the basis for an inclusive conception of the American identity that aren't tied to race or aren't tied to a specific monotheistic religion. Maybe where I'll end is the title of the book is called When the Stars Begin to Fall, and that is a line from a spiritual that enslaved Black folks used to sing. And the idea was that they wanted to be singing about their freedom and desire for emancipation, but they were not allowed to do so. And so they cloaked their desire for freedom and liberty in Christian themes, which they were permitted to sing about. And so When the Stars Begin to Fall, if you look at the lyrics, it's about, in Christianity, when the rapture happens and believers' souls sort of ascend up and everyone is finally is loosened from the struggles of life and live happily ever after in heaven. That was a proxy for emancipation and wanting to be released from this institution of slavery. But it's also a little bit of a play on words because we are at a moment where we can determine what happens next in this country, or at least what direction we're going to take. And the stars on the flag can either be falling into place because we've proven to be the people that make the American project a little bit more achievable than the previous generations, or falling out of the sky as we've lost this opportunity to create a nation that the world has never seen before. So maybe I'll stop there and we can dive into some of these ideas and themes that are in the book.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we were going to start by, I'm not sure if this is a copy for the end. We were going to start by maybe just having a back and forth where I just dig a little deeper into the book. Eric, is that okay? And then open it up to Q&A in just about 10 more minutes or so. So I would say a good time reading this book, and also like a very bleak time reading this book, because it's so hopeful and I would say optimistic in a way that our national dialogue really requires right now, but also things have gotten so much worse, even just in a short amount of time. So the first question, I guess, because we are all scholars of democracy and the rule of law, is we wrestle with whether or not the United States is a democracy and what it means to be backsliding as a democracy. And your concept in your book of trickle-down inclusion sort of says that you can democratize as a society, but that the benefits of citizenship get granted in later ways to some people and probably never. So could you go a little more into the idea of trickle-down inclusion and whether or not you think we meet the standards of a liberal democracy, or if we need some other way of describing what the United States is when we know structural racism is a problem?
Yeah, what a great question. So look, I don't think this is specific to democracies, but it certainly plays out in democracies this way, and certainly in the United States, that like democracy is often seen as a commodity, a thing that some people have that other people desire, and it's the desiring from those that are marginalized that gives it part of its power. And so the fight to be included in the democracy makes it a contested resource that unfortunately then gives it the flavor of being kind of zero sum. The more democracy you get, the less I get, the more voice you have, the less I have. And so whether or not we are a democracy depends on how you would answer the question of struggling for inclusion, whether that is a liberal democratic pursuit or a failure of liberal democracy. In an actual liberal democracy, the rights of the minority are protected and not like denied. And so if we live in a democracy that denies rights to minority groups, but those minority groups desire inclusion into this democracy, is that a liberal democracy? And I think that is a liberalizing democracy to the extent that we are making progress, but not an achieved liberal democracy, which may ultimately, especially in a society like ours, so large and diverse, may not, one of Robert Bellows, who talked about civil religion, I think it was one of his students remarked, it might be the ultimately uncompletable project of liberal democracy in America because of how large and diverse we are. But if we, again, play on the themes of religion, like religion is the ultimate, like the whole, whether you're a Christian or a Muslim, or like, we're trying to achieve this state of love or of compassion for others or respect for others that we never actually get to. And yet it's the journey and the desire to get there that makes us Christian or makes us Muslim. And I think that's what makes us American. It's the desire to create this nation that we may never get to, but we are getting closer to than we have in the past. And I am much happier being a Black man in 2021 than 1921 or 1821. That suggests progress, but it doesn't suggest that we've achieved the ideal or the utopia, which is probably not possible.
Okay. I was also wondering what you think about the political right. So since you wrote this book, I know that it was, you mentioned a lot the campaign of John McCain versus Barack Obama in 2008, and what a watershed, of course, it was when Barack Obama was elected president. But since Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, it seems like race relations have taken a very different turn in the United States. And part of the sort of resurgence of the far right has involved attacks on the state, and that's maybe even been a multi-decade sort of libertarian project. So I love the idea that racism is a crime of the state, but of course, we have a whole contingent of the right that thinks the state shouldn't do anything to intervene in our lives. And also the idea of color consciousness for solidarity. The Federalist Society's main line is discriminating. The only way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race.
Right.
So if we have such a powerful political right, how can we achieve some of this solidarity, some of the things that you described in the book? Or what do you think is the relationship of the resurgence of the right?
Yeah, so the resurgence, I think, is absolutely tied to a growing prominence of white identity politics in the last several decades, relative to where it was previous to that, or at least explicitly. And so let me answer it this way. I think I talked in the book about ontological security, this idea that nation states will go to war to protect their sense of self, their story, their character, their identity, with the same passions and resources that they would if they've been physically attacked or if they've been economically sanctioned. So if we think about 9/11, for example, the things that the United States is known for, the things that make us exceptional in the superpower, our military, our economy, and our democracy. And if you look at the targets of the terrorists on 9/11, it was the Pentagon, a symbol of our military power, the World Trade Center, a symbol of our economic power, and the White House. Flight 93 that went down in Pennsylvania was headed to the White House, which is a symbol of our democracy. And so what made it, and then it led to the longest war in our history, with 20 years in Afghanistan, that we only just left this past summer. And it's because it wasn't just about the national security danger of terrorism. It was, we felt we had to remind the world, or at least reconvince the world, that the things that made us a superpower, the things that are defining factors of our character, still held true. And we were willing to expend life, blood, resources, treasures for 2 decades in order to make this case to the world. And then I guess when the nation had decided, okay, it was sufficient, we rolled out of there. I say all this to say that a lot of folks on the far right believe that the character of the United States is under attack by these, liberals and these, immigration and all of these minority groups that are claiming that racism is the reason they haven't been able to enjoy America and that white people are at fault. So they actually feel like they're this whole "Make America Great Again" is the idea that we want the America of old, where to be American meant to be white and Christian and sort of hardworking and pay your taxes and serve in the military, that sort of thing. And when people felt the identity of the nation changing, something that I think the election of Barack Obama really brought to the fore. Now we've got this Black guy with a Muslim name who's this child of a Kenyan immigrant who is a closet socialist in the White House with his Black family. that does not fit the picture of American identity. And it isn't coincidence that just years after that, the Tea Party shows up and it's racial resentment runs high in that movement. So the far right believes they are fighting an identity battle to sort of reclaim the America of their forefathers. And they feel like they are being villainized and demonized by others who want to make America more inclusive of the people that it has marginalized since its inception. And so we are witnessing the beginnings or the continuance of a battle about who we are, who we say we are, who we believe we are, more than we are about like K through 12 curriculum and critical race theory and these other things. The last thing I'll say on this point is it doesn't bode well. I mentioned all the stuff in the 60s, these massive pieces of legislation, but Kennedy was assassinated. And King was assassinated, and Martin Luther and Malcolm X was assassinated, and RFK was assassinated. There were hundreds of race riots in '67, dozens after Martin Luther King was killed. There was Vietnam protests. People were killed at Kent State. It was a lot of political violence in the '60s that attended a lot of the racial progress that we saw and the racial unrest. So January 6th, I think, was either a leading indicator or a warning of the kind of political violence that awaits if we can't resolve the question of whether America is for us all, or if it's for a select few who, through the graciousness of their hearts, decide to let others participate in what's supposed to be a liberal democracy.
All right, well, my final question, and then we'll open it up, is just how you decided as a scholar to write a book like this. So I thought it was such a fascinating way of interweaving memoir and narrative, and it opens with a really compelling story about being a kid and being called the N-word while playing with other friends. And then you also have dense, but not jargony, academic discussions of the kind we would all be familiar with. And then you also have like a normative call for what we can do. And, we're all taught to maybe not be normative or to be testing our hypotheses or whatever. How did you decide to go this route, and what do you hope for the book to accomplish?
Yeah, so the book was actually supposed to be a true expansion of my dissertation, which looks at the electoral behavior of African Americans from really 1867 forward, and suggests what that tells us about the failings of our democracy as well as the promise. And then that was the desire in the summer of 16, and then Donald Trump won in the fall, and no one cared about Black voters anymore. I mean, agents, publishers, it was all hillbilly elegy, strangers in their own land, like, let's go learn about the Trump voter. So this book is an expansion of the lessons that Black America has for the United States and democracy that was supposed to be focused specifically on electoral politics, but sort of expanded beyond that. And so it's, so once I had that, I knew that if I just talked about Black history and Black solidarity as a lesson forward, a lot of people have written books like that. And if I just talked about some of the normative things to improve our democracy, lots of people have written about that. If I just wrote memoir about the Black experience and the lesson that could be pulled there, we have books on that. But no one had tried to do all of those things together to show that these aren't separate pursuits, that the sociology Du Bois was doing is very much like the political science that Michael Dawson at Chicago has done. And they are the same story. It's the same experience, it's the same lessons. And so I wondered, in 90,000 words, can I bring all of these ideas together to tell a cohesive story about what lessons Black America has for a nation hoping to become a more perfect union? And that's what led me to this. And also because the stories give it life and make it, fun to read. It gives it characters in ways that talking about like Jean Rousseau or correct, may not. So you will read a section that's very dense, and then there's a break, and then all of a sudden we're in 1920 with my great grandfather, and learning sort of all those ideas I just talked about. Look at how when it touched his life, look at what he did and how they responded. And for my great grandfather, it was, we're going to name our child after the president as a claim on our Americanness, and that name has sort of carried with me through today.
Excellent. Well, it's so good. Okay, so let's open it up. Eric.
Ted, I just love this talk. Thank you. I needed it at this juncture in the quarter. Eric Jensen, I'm at the law school and at CDDRL. I completely agree with you about the promise. it's right there in the Declaration of Independence, and that was a sense of nationhood. I'm not sure if it's going to come back. I'll get to that. And I agree with you about how racism is contained and controlled and minimized by virtue of state interests. Machiavelli onward. I can't really disagree with that. That's a bottom line. And it's interesting you talk about civil religion. I have a colleague at the law faculty who talked about the Constitution as a civil religion back in the 1980s. But then I'm left wondering because how do you nudge national interests against racism? That seems to me to be a lot of political action with the fragmentation that Dee mentioned that's on our minds every day, with a party that is identified as a white supremacist party. I don't see this going away in the next 2 decades.
Yeah.
And I wish it wasn't, but I just see a really hard times over the next 20 years. And I'm asking you for some hope.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. So look, I think it's the Guyland and Page paper from a few years ago, the testing theories of American politics, or something like that, that says public policy outcomes are 15 times more responsive to economic elites than they are to the average citizen, and 9 times more responsive to organized business interests than average citizens. But the other thing it says is that it's 5 times more responsive to social movements than to average citizens, which tells me that the way to sort of shape the national interest is to get those things to align. Now, it's easy to say, but how do I get elites to want the same things as business, to want the same thing as social movements? And that is very, very difficult. But whenever we look at major, whether it's economic issues around minimum wage or children labor or civil rights or suffrage, those things have aligned. I mean, even prohibition was like a responsiveness to social movements and the business interests. And then the revocation of prohibition was responsive to social movements and business interests. So that's how I think we nudge it. Now, how do we get those to align? I don't know. I think it's like a character like Obama, who rose to national prominence basically with maybe the most civil religious speech of this century in the 2004 DNC speech, and became the face against which people organized because it wasn't the prototypical American. Then that would suggest the only way is for like a white Christian straight man to convince others that the American identity is compatible with diversity, and convince business that it's just like it's a 3-bank alley-oop that becomes almost impossible. And yet, in those moments in our history where the nation either was on the verge of collapse or did, we found a way through it, and we left people behind, but we found a way through it. So if history is a guide, it will suggest that things may get a little painful, but we'll figure our way through it. But nations also collapse when history says otherwise, that maybe they shouldn't have. And if this becomes 2 sides digging in on the basis of group identity, then I don't know that there's any way to sort of pull out of that without showing everyone that it's in the national interest for us to come together, and which will mean sacrifice by some groups at the top of the hierarchy, and will mean forbearance by those that are not. And those are very hard asks to make on both sides when it's an identity kind of question. I don't know if that's hopeful or not, but.
Sean?
Thank you very much for your talk, which I found to be very engaging and also very inspiring. And I also echo what Dee said about how amazing it is that you're able to intertwine all these scholarly thoughts with a lot of personal insights and bring your personal insights to and personal experience to bear on big questions that we're posing. I have a question regarding, I want to follow up on your last response to Didi's question, and specifically with regards to the roots of the white nationalist coalition that is rising on the American right. And one of the things that you've mentioned is or at least your response seems to echo a lot of the politics of recognition narratives that are emerging, that something happened around the time when Barack Obama was elected president, that people felt that their own perception of what they perceive to be a true American identity is under attack, and therefore they're reacting, they're trying to protect it, they're trying to push back. So that's one narrative. And I'm wondering if we could maybe perhaps reconcile this with a different narrative, because there is a different narrative, sort of the what's the matter with Kansas story, right? That the right is actually threatened by the idea that it could very well lose its space among middle-class Americans, and its only way of being able to salvage that is to play on identity politics, on race, on immigration, and to engage more broadly in these types of culture wars. And I'm wondering if there is room for reconciling these narratives in the context of your own book.
I hope so. I think there is. I think the way out of this space is not making material appeals to people, not by saying you get better healthcare if racism is gone, and you save on your taxes and you get a more responsive government. I don't think people like the what's the matter with Kansas story is people working against their own interests because frankly, they feel like their identity is under attack because of these culture wars. And so how do we work ourselves out of culture wars that are intentionally racialized? And I think it will require a democracy that doesn't reward those who are the best at polarizing. And I naively, I used to think that we had that kind of democracy, that there was that decade by decade, we got a little bit more, the kinds of acceptable behavior were closer to the kind of people we hope to be and less like the people we used to be. And I think in the last decade, I think people are willing to scrap the things they say I love my freedom and I love my liberty and the Constitution and I believe in, everyone working hard no matter what color your skin and like all that stuff. I think they're willing to say, that's fine when we have a nation that cares about me. And right now, I think too many people who would rather see me not here have decided that they're going to create a nation that makes it difficult for me to be here or prosper here. And so all of that high-minded stuff around, inclusion, and that's for a later fight. Right now, we're in an existential battle, and that existential battle has racial and cultural tones to it. And until we get out of that, I don't know what the off-ramp is to this current culture that we're in. I do think, and so I say all that to say, that if there is a silver bullet, it is we have self-segregated by race and class all across, in every state in this country, every city. You tend to live around people who either make as much money as you do, have as much education as you do, or are the same race and ethnicity as you are. And so when in a nation of our size, when we have decreased social contact with people who are different from us, it becomes really easy for people to stroll along and demonize those people that we don't really know and say that the reason you don't have the nation you want is because of those people over there. And we can't be resilient to those appeals because we don't actually have connections to the people that are being demonized. So I think increased social contact, which is essentially the argument for integration, is key to it all. And whether that's through national service or civic education or whatever it is, but we have to almost be incentivized, if not compelled, mandated to get to know each other as fellow citizens, but not just contact alone. Lots of sociology shows that contact in and of itself can often create more animus and tension between groups. And so it has to be contact with a superordinate goal, project, mission, and principled leadership. Often that superordinate goal is war, and the principle of leadership comes from the president in times of war. War is not going to get us out of this. War just postpones the question that we've not yet managed to answer sufficiently. And so I don't know what that focusing event is, and I don't know where that leader or set of leaders are, but all of those things are required: contact, goal, and leadership to get us out. And frankly, I don't think it's going to be top down. We get it right, it won't be top down. It'll be communities by communities figuring out. We can't the school board election can't be Donald Trump versus AOC. and that's how everything is caricatured. And so I think if the nation is to sort of renew itself, I think it will be a grassroots renewal and not sort of a charismatic president who then, redeems us.
I guess building off of that, and going back to our story it started with, how much of the story maybe in the civil rights movement was we needed to, at that time, we were in the Cold War, we had to demonstrate that we are a democracy and our international reputation is at stake. I just saw a headline that this conference on democracy, what's it called?
For the Summit on Democracy.
Summit on Democracy.
Oh, that's right.
Putin was criticizing as just a joke because look at how Black men are treated in
Right.
this country.
So watch Russian television as I do. It's all over Russian
Yeah,
television.
and they've been doing this for a century. They dropped leaflets in World War I and II, or World War II, the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, as a way of sort of saying, democracy is not all it's cracked up to be. Look at how they treat these folks.
Okay, so not much has changed. And we responded to that international environment then. And today, do we have, maybe we don't feel the need to respond to that international environment. I think, our reputation abroad is important, it has been damaged. But maybe Americans don't care about that. Like, why isn't that doing the same thing it did in the 50s and 60s today? Is one part of the question. The other one is, will we actually be able to solve this problem if it comes, like, I think nationalism does respond to these international threats, but will we be able to solve the problem if we're responding, if it's coming from outside, rather than just some inherent domestic bottom-up change and belief in this promise, that is what it is to be American?
Right, yeah, to the first question, I think the 50s and 60s, the 40s to the 60s, we had just come off of 2 world wars and a Great Depression. 6 million Black folks had left the South and had moved north. Lots of immigration from Ireland and Poland and Germany happening during this time. So the complexion of the nation was changing at a time where world wars were happening and our economy was not stable. And that getting through the first 50 years of the last century in a racial and ethnically changing way created just the conditions for the next 2 decades. So even though redlining was real, even though voting rights were still withheld from lots of folks, we were smaller, there was demographic change, but demographic change that was forcibly managed because of the existential threats we were facing through war and the economy. And I think that gave us the capacity for the 50s and the 60s. And yet in 1968, George Wallace runs for president on a segregationist ticket and won, 4 states or something like the last time a third party has won any electoral college votes. So it wasn't like we solved it, but we created the conditions such that the morally correct thing to do was also in the national interest, to a point. That doesn't exist now. That we've since at least 1991, after the Soviet Union collapses and we decimated Iraq in a very fast war, we have been almost like our safety has been such a given that we've relaxed in a lot of ways from the world, and even though 9/11 sort of forced us to engage, it wasn't at the same level and with the same longstanding public support as some of the previous conflicts have been. I mean, I think by the time Obama came on the scene in 2004, people were kind of like, yeah, maybe we should be getting out of Iraq now. Like maybe this is certainly by like 6 and 7. So I think that is sort of like the domestic and global conditions at the time, and that led to the 50s and 60s of change we don't have today. And then the second part of your question was
So would that, okay, say we did have that, is that the solution?
Oh, is that right?
Or does it really have to come from the to generate?
Yeah, and so I don't know, but a lot of folks believe that we need an other. And, like we define ourselves by saying what we are not, and othering is not a good way to define yourself. I mean, just like in basic political strategy, there's a reason on the abortion debate, there's the pro-life side and the pro-choice side, and not an anti-any side, because being anti something means you're defining yourself by what you're against or what you don't like. Defund the police, for example, didn't go as far as it could have because it was about the things they didn't like and didn't want to do instead of what they did like and did want to do. So the anti positions often are successful when it comes to status quo, anti-CRT. Like, we don't want things that are going to change, but when you're trying to create change, defining yourself against the thing you don't want isn't helpful. And othering, we need to find a new enemy before we can engage, isn't helpful. I thought that COVID was going to be an opportunity for us to come together in many ways that like folks thought climate would be, and instead immediately politicized the mask, the vaccine, schools. And so if it's not, I mean, if it shouldn't be war, and it can't be a national threat that doesn't demonize anyone, that is like a virus or a natural disaster, then what is the thing? And it has to come from, we have to be, I think Americans in particular are still a bit of a hero culture. We have to kind of be convinced by our exemplars that the path forward is that this path forward is going to require some introspection, and that introspection is actually not going to make my life worse. That I'm not going to be demonized as a result. I'm not going to have to give up more tax money as a result.
It seemed to me like Obama was doing that. Like, to me,
tried.
that was perfect. He was the hero, he was the promise, and yet the reaction.
He actually was. I mean, he says this all the time, and I think it almost feels like hyperbole to say it now, but he was kind of the fulfillment of a lot of what is written down, but he wasn't the embodiment of it. Like, he wasn't the personification of it in a way that the nation would accept without contesting. If he had come in a different package with a different backstory, who knows if he would have been, I don't know if I don't know if he would have been like a Lincoln kind of person or not, but that name and that skin and that was central to the rejection by many in the country. And it wasn't just happenstance that we don't like this tax policy. Oh, and he's got this weird name. It was the other way around. He's got this weird name. And the last thing I'll say, and this is sort of an aside, McCain, remember that time when this lady at in red at a
Muslim
campaign event, he's like, yeah, he's a Muslim and we don't want Muslim. And McCain said, look, I disagree with him on a lot of things, but he's not Muslim. He's a good man. He just has a different vision. Today, we literally saw what happens. Ilhan Omar is a Muslim, and I'm glad there was no bomb. And it's a joke. I mean, it's embraced. And so we are going in the wrong direction, and we are rewarding leadership that is demagoguing and dividing instead of uniting.
Well, so just to add a little nuance. So she's not embraced by everyone. She's most certainly not embraced by me.
Right,
and I would assert everyone at the table, right? And so when we look at the far right and these goofballs on January 6th, those are sort of more fringe who get a lot of attention, right? Because that was a very dramatic thing to have done. Happily, Donald Trump came terrifyingly close to winning, but didn't win. In fact, he's a big loser. He lost all three branches. I mean, all three, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So, there's a little bit left there. It's terrifying that he was elected to begin with, right? And outrageous that he was elected, especially on the heels of Obama. But I think we have to you've said a lot of just fascinating things, and it's a fascinating book. But I think we have to disaggregate, like it's not all of the country.
Right.
Right. And it's not, I'm as outraged by Boebert and what's her name, the other dipstick, what's her name? Margaret Taylor Greene. As hopefully the next person. These people should never be given a microphone, right? But there have always been people like this, unfortunately, and social media. And so this is actually my point, is that part of what's given rise to I think this at this time is also technological change in two ways, right? So why is identity politics, white identity politics, for some white people, but not all.
Right.
salient at the moment? Well, they're losing their jobs, the working class white people, to robots, right? And to computers. And you can't, there's no toll booth, person sitting in the toll booth at the Golden Gate Bridge anymore, $7 or whatever, right? It's done by automatically, as it should be, right? So this happened in the Industrial Revolution as well. It's huge technological change, and then so huge social dislocation. And we as social scientists sit back dispassionately and say, well, this is what should happen. And it's painful, but it will all work out. So maybe that will happen. But you have demagogues who come along, Andrew Jackson, who seized the day, right? I mean, when I lived on 30 years ago on the East Coast, he was a joke, man. Like, the guy had he was a joke, right? That no one would have voted for. The rest of you might not be old enough to remember this, but come on. So what's happened? I think, he didn't really change. He never believed in anything. He used to be pro-choice. He's a political entrepreneur who seized on a particular moment of social dislocation among a particular group of people in the United States. And this is why we see it in other places in the world as well. So the other way I think technology has created this terrible moment is the speed with which false information flows, right? And so it seems to me we have to, yes, it's a state crime. There's structural racism that's reinforced by these technological changes in this social dislocation at the same time. So, to the extent that Obama failed or people didn't like his name, or I think it's actually started earlier than that with sort of globalization and assuming everyone would do fine with that. There'd be some problems,
Right.
But everyone will be fine and it'll be good for us all. And it turns out it hasn't been good for people who want that 1950s lifestyle when you can come out of high school and get a good job in a factory and you can stay there for life or 30 years at IBM, as you mentioned your parents.
Right.
That's not what happens anymore.
That's right.
Right. And that's a very hard thing for people to adjust to. It was a very hard thing in the former Soviet Union for people, states of the former Soviet Union. It's still hard in Eastern Europe for people to adjust to. So I think that's a lot of the story here as well, right? Is this big technological change, this globalization, and then people looking for an other to blame, and it's Black people, and it's immigrants, right? And so we've seen these moments before, as you said. So what the question is, what do we do about it, and what's the state's responsibility in trying to ameliorate the dislocation, as opposed to just let's try to write this up?
Right. Yeah. And so I think like when we in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1900s, where there's lots of immigration from different places. And those folks were coming here mostly as blank canvases. Like they were doing the work that was available, whether it was on farms or in industry or wherever in patronage positions like police chiefs or policemen, et cetera. And now what we're trying to do, what the digital revolution has required, is that people change professions, but they have to divorce a culture to do so. And so like when Hillary Clinton said in West Virginia, sorry, but coal is basically, it's not the future. It's true. It's true. And yet you have coal miners who are saying she's trying to erase my family's history in West Virginia. And so they didn't want wind turbine training. They didn't want to go to 90-day coding camps. They wanted to be a coal miner like their daddy and like their granddaddy. And someone saying that doesn't have a place in tomorrow's America, even though it's a true economic argument, suddenly was like culturally offensive. Yeah. And I think that has been the part, it sort of goes back to the identity question about what kind of Americans to be valued. And it used to be a very racialized question. Now it's, as the demographics are changing, it's like, I don't know, a Black guy can be president. And but when that happens, and we're coming off war with veterans coming home, a lot of white men addicted to painkillers, no work in their hometowns. Like now it's suddenly no prospect, no future, unless I'm willing to leave my community and go live in San Francisco and do coding in Silicon Valley. And if those are my choices, when someone comes along and say the Democrats are trying to change your cities, and they're trying to, tell you your way of life is no longer worth protecting. I'm here to say we love our farmers, and we don't want our jobs going to Mexico. And suddenly, like, that's all we're asking for. Just bring back the world that I used to know, where I can prosper. And that, you can't reason that away with training and education. It's like this very deep identity cultural thing.
But do you think his failure to do those things will make a difference? I mean, after all, he wasn't reelected.
Right. So we'll see. I do think people sort of rejected. He was just so really rough around the edges, and they got sick of the carnival. But we'll see. I mean, it still requires an othering of sorts, and that's the part of it that means people will just come find a new way to divide us instead of, changing arguments or changing tactics.
So we can wrap up with just a few questions that have come in on Zoom. Two that I will sort of group. One question is about manifest destiny and how sort of those ideals in our history have affected race politics. And the other is about educational curricula and civic education. And I was just going to use that question as a way for you to potentially discuss some of the solutions in the final chapters of the book, such as deliberation, democratic reform, national service, voluntary national service, and you do discuss civic education a bit. So
yeah, so it's so interesting. The end of myth. I can't remember the author of the book, but talks about manifest destiny and how like that is such a defining part of the American character of like new lands to conquer, not because we hate the people, but because that's where opportunity is and it requires expansion and exploration. And then I think our national security apparatus is reflective of, we spend $750 billion to be everywhere all the time, virtually and physically, to the point that our security doesn't begin at the border. It actually begins at other people's borders, in their water, in their airports, et cetera. But I do think there is a crisis of adventure that the American character has always kind of had, that we don't really want to make the world safe for democracy anymore. We don't really want to be the world's policeman anymore. That's not the average American. And so, but if manifest destiny is like central to our character and there is no destiny to manifest, then what does one do? And I think that it turns inward. And so now the last frontier is a multiracial liberal democracy. And I think the people now protecting the frontier or like trying to deny the expansion are the same folks that were, leading the country when we were doing geographical sort of. And so this is now a homeland battle. This is about protecting the frontier. And they've in a way become the homesteaders who don't want to be kicked off their land instead of the folks that were doing the removal in search of opportunity. So I do think that's the manifest destiny conversation is now cultural and been turned inwards. And we will see if we're able to create a multiracial liberal democracy without tearing the thing apart, and whether those that are sort of the self-appointed defenders of the realm will go along with it. And I don't know. I will say that, going back to civil religion, the author Bella, the sociologist from Berkeley, said the first time of trial for the country was our founding and whether or not we could divorce ourselves from Great Britain and become this new thing. The second time of trial was over the question of slavery and whether a nation founded on the idea that all men are created equal could abolish slavery to move closer. The third time of trial that he said in 1967 was whether our form of government could be extended to others. And so it's not really a make a world safer democracy, but can we prove that a diverse, large democratic republic can prosper in a way that would be an example for the world to show that we don't have to just protect our resources and look for people who are like us, but we actually can have prosperity when it's shared. And I think this question of manifest destiny is kind of a version of that third time of trial. In terms of solutions, I mean, I wrote the book and then my editor was like, you have to give people solutions. Like, and I was like, I don't know, solve racism. That's pretty, that's a big ask. Right? And so I tried to say, okay, if there were things that could be done that could usher in an era of a public more receptive to multiracial solidarity, what would those things be? I think one is absolutely democracy reform in terms of our systems, our institutions, our processes, voting rights, gerrymandering, money in politics, all these sorts of things. So I think that's the one big thing. A second one is civic education, and not the K through 12. Do you know who your congressperson is? Do you know the branch of government? But what the Greeks called paideia, like, do we train people to be citizens? Do we teach people how to stay lifelong learners and actively engaged in democracy? And we don't. We sort of give them some civics and then say, congratulations, you're 18, you can die in war and you can vote. So enjoy and smoke cigarettes, I guess, like, and have fun. And then there's no revisiting of civic anything unless it's self-initiated. And so I think a program around that, and I don't know exactly what it would look like, but it's not credentialing, it's not badging, it's not, I think there's a role of social capital needs to be associated with civic learning, such that people who don't pursue it are seen to be like lazy citizens. And I don't know how to create that social capital. But I think it's central. The third thing is national service. I'm biased because I was a military guy, but I'll tell you, there was like a benefit to working alongside guys from like Council Bluffs, Iowa, and Baltimore and LA, because they're no longer caricatures of groups you don't know. You know the people, and you have experience. It's probably not constitutional to mandate national service, and if you incentivize it, then only people who need the incentive participate, and which leaves probably those economic leaders out of it. So there's, I think, another role for social capital there. In much the same way that, like, responding to draft calls in World War II, if you were the guy that skipped out, you know, and everyone else on the block there were kids who are all fighting, and that was a social penalty, like, or ostracization you might face. Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3. The fourth one is deliberative democracy, and this is, compelling people in the same way that we compel them to do jury duty, to engage in democratic processes in their communities, and making them come together, decide how a portion of the city budget will be spent, and then make those decisions binding, and force people to be integral to the process of democracy. Not only will they understand the process better and know where decisions come from, but they'll interact with people that they may not normally come across because of the discussions. And then the last one is the one that's more difficult, and I call it transformative leadership. We have all these things, and then we have people who are exploiting division. We don't get the benefits. And so we need transformative leaders. And but I do think they are at the local level, and not just like the right president at the right time. And those 5 things are sort of the super solutions that I hope will inch us one bit closer to leaving behind a better country than the one we have.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ted. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone, for being
Thank
here.
you
Thanks
all.
for our Zoom audience.
And the book is for sale.
Indeed.
Yes, it is. I brought my Sharpie.
I was going to give you
I'm feeling a little vain, so.
all my signing first.
Yeah.